ADHD functions as a disorder of performance and execution. It exists independently of a person's baseline intelligence or their capacity to understand a task. The neurological source of this performance gap is the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for the brain's executive functions, or high-level management. Think of the brain as a symphony orchestra. Each part, empathy, movement, emotion, and focus, is a highly skilled musician. But without a functional conductor to provide rhythm, these talented nodes operate efficiently but fire out of sync. This creates a disconnect between knowledge and initiation. An individual may know exactly what needs to be done, but the neurological go signal required to begin the performance fails to trigger. Because this central regulator is offbeat, the brain struggles to coordinate focus, regulate emotional responses, and control physical movement simultaneously. To evaluate ADHD, we have to stop looking at it as a lack of effort and start viewing the brain as a complex management system. Clinicians use this perspective to measure specific failures in coordination. The term ADD, which gained popularity in the 1980s, is no longer used in clinical practice. It was retired because it focused solely on attention, ignoring the broader regulatory issues at play. The current clinical standard is the DSM-5. This manual recognizes that attention is just one part of a larger spectrum of management failures. Under the name ADHD, hyperactivity and impulsivity are no longer viewed as separate issues, but as behaviors structurally linked to the same regulatory deficit as inattention. This nomenclature shift forced psychiatry to move away from a single trait diagnosis, instead evaluating patients across two distinct, measurable behavioral axes. This dual-axis model provides the matrix clinicians use today to separate general human behavior from a diagnosable medical condition. The diagnostic process begins with a two-axis matrix evaluating inattention and hyperactivity impulsivity. The inattention axis tracks working memory and sustained focus, like losing items or avoiding complex tasks. The hyperactivity axis measures physical restlessness, like constant fidgeting, and verbal impulsivity, like blurting out answers. Most people experience these traits occasionally. However, a medical diagnosis requires that these behaviors pass through several rigid mathematical gates. The first gate is numerical. A child must exhibit at least 6 of the 9 symptoms, and adults 5. The second is chronological. Traits must be observed continuously for over 6 months. Finally, a developmental requirement mandates symptom onset before age 12. The symptoms must be pervasive, meaning they appear in 2 or more settings, such as both home and school, to prove the issue is internal and not just a reaction to a specific environment. Finally, there must be clear evidence of impairment. These traits must measurably interfere with the patient's ability to function or develop in their daily life. These strict gates are designed to ensure that a diagnosis is reserved for those with a pervasive structural executive function impairment. This data reveals 3 distinct profiles. The first is primarily inattentive. These patients meet the threshold for focus issues but remain subclinical on the hyperactivity axis. Because this presentation doesn't involve disruptive physical behavior, it is frequently overlooked by teachers. This leads to a documented gender bias where girls with the condition are often left undiagnosed. The second profile is primarily hyperactive impulsive, crossing the threshold only on the movement axis. The combined type represents the third profile, meeting requirements across both columns simultaneously. Clinicians then scale these severity, mild, moderate, or severe, based on how many total symptoms are present beyond the minimum requirement. This framework is highly effective at identifying executive dysfunction. However, defining the condition strictly by these deficits misses how these brains function in different contexts. The DSM-5 labels these traits as impairments because our societal standards for normal functioning are rooted in the requirements of industrial-era environments. Traditional education is built on a demand for static physical compliance and uniform attention, settings that inherently penalize natural neurovariance. This environmental rigidity continues into the modern workplace, which rewards prolonged, passive focus in highly repetitive, isolated structures. But when we move away from these specific constraints, we find that these medical deficits can transform into high-utility cognitive adaptations. This is context-dependent cognitive adaptation, the idea that ADHD is not just a collection of flaws, but an operating system that requires a matching environment to thrive. We can re-examine the diagnostic matrix through an adaptive lens, mapping each clinical deficit to a corresponding evolutionary strength. The clinical inability to transition attention translates to hyperfocus. When the task provides high interest, the brain enters an efficient flow state that allows for deep, prolonged output that others struggle to maintain. What clinicians call distractibility is the result of a wider attentional gate. Because the brain doesn't filter out peripheral stimuli, it takes in a high volume of extraneous data. This allows the individual to connect concepts that a more filtered brain would never associate, driving rapid, creative problem solving. Motor hyperactivity provides a stamina advantage in fast-paced or unpredictable environments. This high-energy execution allows for a level of physical and mental endurance that is essential in a crisis. In high-stakes situations, the typical inhibitory pause, the moment of hesitation while assessing risk, is shortened. This allows for the kind of rapid, spontaneous action required when an over-analysis of long-term consequences would lead to failure. ADHD remains a serious neurological profile that requires precise identification and management, but it functions as an alternative architecture of attention, one that yields immense adaptive power when the environment matches the operating system.
Hello, everyone! Do you have any ideas for our next video? Just write them down in the comments below, and I will explain them in the next one. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like this video and share it with your friends, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button.